Welcome, everybody. My name is Max Tim. We have Shayna Weber with us. Usually, Shayna and I are recording our Insider News YouTube show that we do every week. If you haven't heard of it, you should check it out. Just go to International Screenwriters Association on YouTube. But of course, our special guest, our honoree, if you will, at the very least for having written this incredible book, John Truby. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you, Max. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here. I am a huge fan of ISA. I love what you do for writers, and I couldn't be happier to be here to talk about this book.
And there's a lot to talk about. Shayna and I, in our prep meeting with John, just for everybody to kind of get it behind the curtains, even in our prep meeting, Shayna and I were like, writing down educational tips.
I'm like, wait, I can't. Oh. And then reading the book was just like, oh my, it's so packed with actual useful information that makes me as a writer feel like I'm not only learning, but like I'm absorbing information that I know that I can use. It's not fluffy. Yeah. It's actual, like, legitimate knowledge. And it's
Can I quote you on that?
Yes,
actual legitimate knowledge.
I love that. I don't like to blow smoke. I got Wednesday Addams energy. I don't blow smoke. So when I was reading this, I was like, wow, this is actually a really, really, really good book. So
thank you. It's a brainstorming tool just as much as it is a theorizing exercise and learning the background of each individual genre, which we're going to talk about extensively today. I wanted to read something that might be a nice way to get into how, just the genesis of this book in the first place, from your point of view, John, what made you want to write this, et cetera, but also just a little bit more of a broad stroke story discussion. So on page 5, this I'm pulling right from your book, you talk about how storytelling and the need for storytelling has changed over so many, millennia. And today it's almost a little bit more of a luxury, which made me so sad. But you mentioned, and I'm reading right from the book, yet there's a different way of looking at things. Stories don't just serve as forms of entertainment. They encapsulate everything from the basic organizing principles of the world to how we should live our lives in it. In this sense, everything is about poetics or storytelling. So is that where a lot of this was coming from? Like, what was the impetus of why you felt like you wanted to write this book?
Well, it's interesting, the genesis of the book, that's kind of, the more I explored this subject, the more I realized just how deep and vast it is. So that as you just read from the book, it's not just something that those of us who write screenplays or novels like to do. We love to express ourselves in fiction, and hopefully people will read it. No, it's embedded in our minds. It is our very life. It is what makes us human. And, it's kind of found in the subtitle of the book, which is The Anatomy of Genres, How Story Forms Explain the Way the World Works. And so I like to use this distinction, which is, we think of humans as the storytelling animals. We tell stories, but in fact, we are stories. And we are stories from the very first moment that we're born. We begin to create the first story of our lives, which is me, the story of me. And we begin to work through the 7 major structure steps that are found in any good story, beginning with the weakness need, the lack, which is I'm hungry, and the desire, which is going to solve that lack, which is mother's milk. And as we grow older, we start to say, that's an ally, that's an opponent. And so we start to flesh out our own story. And in doing that, the way we totally understand the world is through this story filter. And that's why in the book, it has that huge subtitle, which is that stories tell us, first of all, how the world works. And second of all, they tell us how to live in the world, how to live successfully in the world. And what's the beauty of genres, which I discovered and did not know until I started writing the book, was that each genre gives us a different portal into how the world works. And it gives us a different philosophy for how to live. And this just totally blew my mind in terms of the power that genres have, and therefore what we need to do as writers in order to tap into that, to make the connection with our readers.
And do we tend to live through all genres during our lifetime in some ways?
That is probably the biggest reveal that I had in writing the book, which is that we tend to gravitate towards certain genres, both in terms of what we write and in how we live. And one of the ways that you want to determine the genres that you write are what genre expresses my values. Because these genres, these life philosophies are simply a set of values for how to live. And so, yeah, we tend to gravitate toward 2 or 3. But one of the things that I discovered, and the reason that the book is sequenced in the way it is in terms of the chapters, is that the wisdom that you get from these genres is only complete when you experience them all. And that's why I always suggest to people when they're reading the book, start with the genres that you write, focus on that because that's where you need to be an expert. But do yourself a favor, read through the book from beginning to end so that you can get a sense of how these various types of wisdom pull together and can make a difference in your life. And I think that's what, to me, that's why I say in the book, this book isn't just for writers. It's also for anyone who wants to learn from the wisdom that stories give us.
Well, it's interesting because Shanna, you said I'm a Wednesday Addams earlier, even before we started the webinar. And just obviously, you know, Shanna and I know each other well because we're coworkers, but we also host the show, and she's right. And I think there's something really interesting there in terms of voice, because genre and voice tend to work together. I don't think it's necessarily one and the same, but our voices tend to gravitate towards certain genres or allow us to gravitate there. But Shane is also a huge Taylor Swift fan, and there isn't a lot of Wednesday Addams stuff going on. So it's interesting what John was saying about how we do. You think it's 3 genres that we tend to gravitate toward?
Well, 2 or 3. I think, you know, one of the things that I talk about right in the beginning of the book, and we can get to when we talk about the 3 unwritten rules by which the entire entertainment business is governed, is that to be really successful, you have to mix multiple genres. And that is the world that we live in, certainly in film. But there's also a danger, which is that if you mix too many or you don't know how to mix them, because it's not easy, then you get story chaos. Mm-hmm. And so this is, and there's a whole lot of reasons why, and we get into that, but the point is, I think the same is true about your life. There's certain things, there's certain approaches that you have to how you want to live your life. And it's good to really rely on that. That's your foundation. That's your base. That's really who you are.
So let's talk about these unwritten rules that define storytelling today. Why do you feel like let's talk through them, but then why do you feel like these are like really things that all writers or storytellers in general need to know and understand?
Well, the main reason that I started the book with these 3 unwritten rules is because I believe these 3 rules govern the way the entire entertainment business, that means film, television, novels, and video games, how it works. But most writers don't know it. And so they're writing scripts that are not going to the people who want to buy them. So you have to match up what you are writing. Yes, you want to tell the best story you can tell, but it's got to fit within the business or you'll never sell it. So the first rule of story right now is, the first rule of the entertainment business is that every medium in the entertainment business is about buying and selling genres. That is their true business. That is their true product. And what do I mean by that? Genre is simply a type of story. It's a type of plot. And and we know all the major examples: action, horror, fantasy, love story, detective story, crime, science fiction, and so on. And the reason these things are so powerful, and the reason the entertainment business worldwide relies on them, is because these are story forms that have been proven over decades, and in many cases, centuries, and in the case of myth, thousands of years, to be the all-stars of the story world. They are phenomenally popular. And so when you are writing your story, the first thing that you have to do is be able to master the plot system of the main genre of your story. And that is why I talk about in the book, in the first half of every chapter, I go through the 15 to 20 major plot beats that form that genre. That's what the genre is based on. And it's a system of story. It's a system of plot. And it is the sequence of those beats that gives the great effect. This is why I always tell writers, a lot of writers think in terms of tropes. They think, well, I'll just grab a few tropes and I'll throw it together and it'll be great and I'll have a great story. No, if you are thinking in terms of tropes, you'll get about 1/10 of the true power of your storytelling ability. And the reason for that is that tropes are individual story units, and they are unconnected. And so therefore, the reason that the real key to the game is genres is because a genre is a plot system of connected tropes. And it's designed and has evolved over centuries as the most dramatic way to tell that story. So, for example, if you want to talk about the love between two people, the love story beats have evolved to say that in the most effective, the most emotionally powerful way. And so your first job as the storyteller is I need to master the 15 to 20 plot beats in my form. And the reason that is so important and has become so important in the last 20 or 30 years is that in every genre, in every medium, there has been a major increase in plot density. And in other words, what the marketing people, what the money people are saying is, we want to give the audience 2 for the price of 1. Or now it's gotten up to 3 or 4 genres for the price of 1. And here's the problem. What separates the top 1% of writers from everyone else is the ability to write complex plot. At the same time, there are more techniques that go into plot than all the other major writing skills combined. So we have a huge problem that writers are facing in every medium. And the problem is most writers have no idea what all of these techniques are, and certainly not at the professional level. You know, a lot of times I'll go to a conference, screenwriting conference or a novel conference, and I'll talk to writers and they say, and I tell them what I do, and they say, well, I know all about story. You know, I use 3-act structure, or I use Hero's Journey or Save the Cat. And what I have to tell them, and believe me, I don't want to tell them because it's not good news. What I have to tell them is these are fine for beginners, but they have very few practical story techniques and almost none at the professional level. And so what are writers forced to do? They don't know, they haven't learned the hundreds of plot techniques that go into complex plotting. And so what they do is they say, well, I'll just figure this out as I go. And of course, the vast majority of times, they don't figure it out. And so the reason that these genres are so incredibly powerful for you as the writer is that the complex plot is already been figured out. It's part of the system. All you have to do is know what those beats are, what that sequence of beats are, and you're at least in the game. If you don't do that, you're not in the game. And,
So let me ask you this, though, because I feel like,
sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to ask you a quick question before we carry on about this specific thing. And from me being a writer myself, also in Max too, when we think of following these beats or a structure, people want to rebel against that. And they say, well, if everyone's doing that, then there's no surprises. There's no room for trying anything different or making your audience not like, like a romantic comedy.
Absolutely.
So what do you say to people who say, well, I don't want to follow the exact same formula that everyone else does?
I say, you're absolutely right. And that gives us rule 3. Rule 3 is, in order to be successful in the modern entertainment business, you have to transcend the genre. And that means 3 major things. And this is what I go through in the second half of each chapter, where I cover each genre. If you simply hit the beats in the order that they are in the classic story, you're doing what everybody else is doing, right? And so I always tell writers, you're not competing against every other screenwriter in the world. You're competing against other screenwriters in your genre. So if you're just hitting the beats, that gets you in the game, but that does not separate you from the crowd. The only way you can separate from the crowd is to transcend the genre that you're working in. And what do I mean by that? First of all, it means you execute the beat in a way that we've never seen before, or you twist the beats. And this is super important. In other words, we're going to play with the order of beats, because as you just said, that order of beats, which your audience is very familiar with, sets up a set of expectations. And when you twist the beats, you break those expectations. And so what you end up doing is you have your cake and eat it too, because the audience sees that you know the genre that they love. That's why they're there in the first place. But also, you've done it in a way they've never seen before. You surprise them. And what I call it, you've taken the bones and you put a different skin on the surface of those bones. And that combination is incredibly important. The other major way that you transcend the genre and separate yourself out from the crowd is that you express the deeper life philosophy in that form. And that is the theme. And this deeper theme that is so important is probably the least understood part of storytelling today.
Just got like a bloop.
Yeah, I heard that too. Let me just add to this, because you're totally right on so many levels. And I'm not, again, like Shannon was saying, I'm not just blowing smoke, because I think what writers tend to, where their brains go anyway, when they hear the beats, expected beats, plot points, et cetera, is they're thinking structurally. And of course, it is eventually a structural, kind of reveal of those beats. It happens at certain structural points. But what I think writers don't tend to do enough of is staying in that conceptual development process long before you're getting to what happens where. And you're instead thinking, well, I need to study my genre. That's still a conceptual level of development. I need to know what my theme is based on when I'm brainstorming with my genre. That's still conceptual development. And you're not necessarily even conceptualizing story yet. You're just thinking, what do I want to say? How do I want to say it? And then knowing what the genre is, you can then decide, how do I twist those expected beats? That might happen here. And so you're working in a non-linear way, is what I guess that's my summary of what you're trying to say.
You absolutely are. And it starts way back at the premise. And one of the biggest mistakes that writers make is that when they come up with that great story idea, right? And of course, that's one line. And this is the great challenge of us for the screenwriters. We start with a one-line premise, and we have to get it up to a 110-page script. Well, that's a big jump, and that requires a lot of techniques, and that requires a lot of know-how. And so there are all kinds of danger places that you can hit on that journey of fleshing out that entire script. And the first one is right at the premise line, which is if you choose the wrong genre as the vehicle to express that story idea, you may have totally blown the idea. And in the book, I get into where this is most dangerous. And it is in the fact that genres, while each is distinct unto itself, they are often part of a family. And what that means is that within the family, each of those genres shares certain similarities, but they have certain key differences that separate them. And where and some of the major families are, first of all, the speculative fiction family, which is horror, science fiction, and fantasy. A second one is the myth, action, Western combination. But the third one, and this is where it's most dangerous, and it's most likely that your listeners can make a mistake when fleshing out a premise idea, is in the crime family. Because crime includes crime, detective, thriller, and gangster. And a lot of times, crime, and a lot of times we think of crime and detective, well, that's the same thing. No, they work very differently. They both deal with crime at the center of it, but how they play out the beats is very, very different. And one of the ways that I talk about in the book that you can determine what is the best genre to execute this idea is by going to the desire line of your hero. What is your hero's specific goal in this story? And then what you do is you go to the genres, because one of the things that the genres do for us, they do so much work for us. I love it. I love that about the genres. But one of the things they do is they have a predetermined desire line that's already been figured out. And you can see, for example, when you compare crime and detective, you can see right in the desire line how they're different. The desire in detective is to find the truth, usually about a murder, but not always, to find the truth. In a crime story, it's to catch the criminal. So that's why crime moves much closer to action, and it's about the punch-counterpunch between the criminal and the lawman, whereas detective is all about uncovering truth under the facade of false clues. So the way they step out and the way they sequence are very, very different. And so you need to be thinking about that along with what is the theme of my story right from the premise line.
That's so interesting. I love that. You want to go through each of the genres themselves and the philosophies behind them? How do you want to continue forward? We're going to kind of let you run with what you want to talk about.
Let's first I'm just going to point out, we have some really good questions in the chat boxes, everybody. I especially like the one about dramedy. I know John's going to talk about that. But then Robert asked a really good question. If both of you, Mariana and Robert, can put that in the Q&A portion of your Zoom window, we'll get to those because they're really good questions, but it's going to take a decent chunk of time to answer them. So yeah, well, let's get into that, John. What I was surprised to see is the specific number. You've got 14 genres, and I bet there are a lot of writers, including myself, that would not be able to name all 14.
That's because it's very fluid.
Yeah.
What I identified there are the 14 most popular that have been established over the longest period of time. Now, if all you have to do is go to Amazon and see that there are a lot more than 14, but what they really are, if you study them, are subgenres of these major forms. And so what I've done in the book is I've gone through these 14 major forms, and then a lot of times in the second half of the chapter where I talk about transcending it, a lot of times the way you transcend is the way the particular genres you mix, the particular genres you combine. And that, by the way, is the second rule of the unwritten rule of the entertainment business today, which is that to be really successful, you must mix multiple genres. And so the choice that's another huge choice that you make in terms of, am I, for example, going to combine horror with science fiction? Or am I going to combine horror with myth? Gives you two very different forms. but yeah, it's important to keep in mind that these are major story forms. I go through the beats, the major beats of it, but I also talk about a lot of the subforms and the fact that no matter what genres you're working in, the important thing is don't be a slave to these beats. Make the beats work for your story, not the other way around. This is not about getting an A in how did I hit all the story beats for this genre. No, it's about using those genre beats as a tool to help you write the best story you can write that hits the genre, but is also totally original.
I'm sorry, I was muted. All right, well, do you want to go through each individual genre, John? I mean, it's 14 separate
I'd be
ones.
happy to. I don't want to hammer your listeners with just one long droning lecture here, but I do find these things totally fascinating. And maybe the tack I can take is to go through them in the order that I go through them in the book.
Yeah.
Really talk about what is underneath them. What is the genre appear to be about, but what is it really about? Because what it's really about is how you do something great.
Yeah.
And
okay.
I start the book with horror. And the reason for that has to do with the key question that horror asks. And by the way, all of these genres ask a key question. And what that key question does is it focuses the theme. It focuses that life philosophy. And as the writer, you need to answer that question by the end of the story. So in horror, the reason horror is the first genre is because it asks the most fundamental question, which is what is human and what is inhuman? And the horror in a horror story comes from the inhuman invading our world. And we find that horrific. At the highest level of horror story, we see the inhuman in ourselves. And this leads to probably the most important technique for transcending a horror story, which is, and it, by the way, was started in the very first modern horror story, which is Frankenstein, to this day, the greatest of all horror stories, and one of the most influential stories in history. Mary Shelley was just a genius, started the horror form, science fiction form, and so on. It is just, her accomplishment is just overwhelming. But the great technique that she gave us was that in a great horror story, there is a structural flip that occurs, which is that at some point during the story, the monster becomes the hero. And the character that we thought was horrific, we find it is the most human character of all. And the people that we thought were human beings turned out to be monsters who are attacking something that doesn't look like them. And this technique is found in stories as recent as Get Out, brilliant horror story, Shape of Water, District 9. They all use this approach. And it's, again, it's not only thematically powerful, it is very powerful in plot terms because as the reader, we're going along with our supposed main character, and all of a sudden we get this massive flip of expectation, and we go, whoa, I didn't see that coming. And it's just a brilliant move. I would say the next genre to talk about is action. It's the next step up the ladder from horror, because action is about how to be successful. And it is only a slight level higher than the horror form. The horror form is really about how do we confront death? And how do we deal with the sins that we have committed in our life that have never been paid for?
Real quick, John. So what do you mean by level up? It doesn't mean horror is worse than action, obviously, but what do you mean by that in terms of an elevation?
Yep, great question. I mean that in terms of the area of human life that it deals with. So horror is the most primal. It doesn't mean that horror has a lower form of wisdom that it will give us, because it's quite a profound wisdom. It is, how do you deal with your own end in this world? It is a very tough thing for people to face. And it also deals with, as I said, the sins that we have committed that must be paid for, because that is the single most important beat in the horror story, is the sins that are personified in a monster, which then turn around and attack us. Why? Because we didn't pay for those sins, and they will continue to attack us until we do. So when I say the next level up, I'm saying we're going from just dealing with our own death to dealing with taking basic action in the world. And so the question, and that's why action is the closest thing that we have to being in the animal world, because it's all about win or lose. In the animal world, there's nothing in between. You either win, you lose. And what action stories do is they show us the recipe for success. And what that means is they create the most dramatic way to do that by the main character is always a fighter, some version of a fighter. And the basic question that the action story asks is, do you stand and fight, or do you flee and fight another day when the odds are more in your favor? In other words, it's basically the question of freedom versus life. And of course, the action story always says, no, we have to stand and fight. And it when taken to its logical extreme, it can be pretty absurd, because, if you see this, for example, in a Western where, you got one guy on one side of the street with a 6-gun, and he's facing 20 of the most heavily armed guys in the world. And the action story says, you got to stand and fight. Well, that's not really smart necessarily, but that is the series of values that it's based on. And so what that means is that the action hero is always going for greatness. That's what he's all about. It's not just winning this particular fight. It's about being the best in the world. And so the action story really shows us the key techniques for doing that, but they choose the fighter to show us the most dramatic way to do that. The next, let me tell your listeners about, because in each chapter I talk about, first of all, the beats, and then how to transcend it. In an action story, the way you transcend is you write an epic, because an epic is about the fate of the nation is determined by the actions of a single individual or family. And so what you do when you're trying to write an action epic is you choose the main character who is at the fulcrum of the nation. In other words, what they do will determine whether the nation succeeds or fails. Now, this is true in a lot of the genres where we take it, one of the ways that we transcend is we take it to the epic level. And as you can imagine, that's very challenging to write. But that's why I go through the beats in every one of the chapters to tell you exactly how to do it. And, as I talk, I'm thinking, this can be very overwhelming to people when they hear all of this stuff. I've got to hit these 15 to 20 beats. I got to transcend the genre. I got to know what the deeper theme is. I got to express that theme through the plot beats and so on and so forth. I know that it sounds overwhelming, but that's why I wrote the book. And that's why it took me 5 years to write the book, because I lay it out exactly in every chapter how you would do that, including showing you ways to express this stuff in a way that's never been done before.
Well, and I think it's so important, and we're going to keep going with the genres, everybody, but I think it's so important because I don't know how many times, when I'm working with the writer and then we finish the script, we think, kind of put together some kind of a plan for contests to submit to, and they think, well, what genre category should I submit this to? And I'm a little frustrated with myself now for not having done the upfront work with the writer enough, even before we started writing the script. We should have known what the genre was before. And I get it. Some contests are really thin in terms of the types of, genres that you actually enter the script. But we need to be figuring these things out long before the end of the script and go, okay, what genre is this? It's the opposite of what we should be doing.
Well, you're absolutely right. And it's not only the key to marketing that script, it's the key to writing it in the first place.
Yeah.
I mentioned that when you mix genres, you're in danger of story chaos because you get too many heroes, too many opponents, too many desire lines, too many plot beats, and you don't know how to put them together. One of the keys to writing the script successfully in the first place is choose a primary genre that will also then pay off for you when you're trying to market it, going to contests and so on. And they say, well, what genre is it? You know that you've written multiple genres, but you have to tell them what is the single genre that this represents. If you can't do that, you're going to be in big trouble.
All right, well, let's keep going. Looks like the next one is myth.
Next one is myth.
Yeah.
Myth is the oldest of the genres. It is to this day the most popular. And it is the basis of more blockbuster films than any other genre by far. Having said that, it is almost always combined with at least one other genre. Why? Because that updates the myth. Keep in mind, this myth form is thousands of years old, and it's a little long on the tooth there. So it gives us, when we mix with another genre, it modernizes it. The other thing that it does when you mix with another genre is it unifies the myth, because the myth form tracks the longest development span of any story form, the largest growth span of any story. And so, again, it's practically within the form itself. It's an epic. Again, that's very challenging to write. And so when you add another genre to it, it tends to lock it down, to give it a strong foundation and give us beats that we can recognize. That it's not so, it doesn't go all over the place the way some myth stories do. Now, in terms of understanding what it's really about, myth stories are not all about superheroes fighting supervillains. No, the myth story is all about immortality. How do we gain immortality in the limited time that we have on this earth? Now, horror is about immortality in a way too, but it takes a very negative view of it. What myth says is that the way you gain immortality in this world is by finding your destiny. And it defines destiny as not something that the gods have bestowed upon us. It's what are your deepest capabilities? That's what you were born to do. And myth says that if you find your deepest capabilities and then you actualize them, you make that happen, you will have a great life. You will have a fulfilling life, and you will gain some form of immortality that will last long after you're gone. So this is why the myth story form is so powerful, because that's such a great thing to understand in your life, that if I can just find out what I'm really great at and what I love, I will have a good life and I will gain some form of immortality.
It seems like most sports stories are myth oriented, and you don't have sports as a genre.
Sports is a subgenre. It is in the action form, and it is one of the two main ways that you transcend the action form. Okay. And again, remember, action and myth are in the same family. So, and you often get a combination of a sports story with myth. For example, the Natural. Mm-hmm. Natural is a perfect example of a myth sports story, and it's a hell of a picture, right? So, and again, it gets all the elements of sports story that are so dramatic, but it adds in that aspect of immortality that kicks it to a whole other level.
Yeah.
So again, this is the power of mixing genres. It not only gives you more plot beats, it gives you a bigger theme that you can get across to your audience. So, you know, in myth stories like, you know, you've got things like all the superhero movies, Star Wars, of course, which really began this entire move in all mediums to mix genre storytelling. Star Wars is what started it off. And it's been a mixed genre universe ever since. And I think one of the most important films in the myth form that we've ever had is Avatar. And even though Avatar has some story elements that I think are a little silly, it is a revolutionary story, because what it does there is it not only goes from a techno society to a nature society, more importantly, it goes from a male myth to a female myth. And I talk in the myth chapter a lot about female myth because, you know, we've heard from Joseph Campbell that there's this monomyth, right? And I strongly disagree with him. The man was a giant in story, but I think this monomyth is a very bad idea. And when you look at the monomyth and you break it down structurally, you find out it is not the one story that all stories express. No, it is essentially a male warrior myth. And that is a very limiting form of hero. Now, where does this female myth come from? Actually, female myth was a very popular story form until about 3,000 years ago, when it was wiped out, because female myth cultures were wiped out by male myth cultures. And it's only in the last really 10 years that the female myth has started to come back in Western culture. And it is coming back strong. I believe the female myth will be one of the major story forms of the next few decades and beyond. And if you have any interest in this area, write one of those, because nobody else has done it. And the film that started it is Avatar.
So what are the primary differences then between the male myth and the female myth?
Well, it's a great question. And here's the problem. A lot of people have a problem. They're so used to how story structure works based on the male warrior myth story that they can't see other story forms. They don't understand what those could be. Now, what do I mean in particular? To me, the easiest way to distinguish between male myth and female myth can be described in one line, which is male myth is divide and conquer. Female myth is combine and grow. And it comes from what they are based on. The male myth story is based on the hunter. The female myth story is based on growing crops. It's circular and it's seasonal, and we get rebirth. And so the problem is that when the only stories we've ever seen in our lives has to do with male warrior myth, it means that we put a premium on conflict. And anybody who's worked with writers, we've said this 1,000 times, you need maximum conflict in the story. Well, yeah, that makes a very, quote, dramatic story. However, that also means that you are solving problems with maximum violence, maximum conflict, right? And so the first thing that you have to do, in the book, I go into what the female myth beats are and how they differ from the male myth beats. Again, so you can see exactly how you would do it. But the fundamental thing you have to understand is the way they handle conflict. The male myth story is about how to apply the most conflict possible. The female myth story is about how to diffuse conflict so that we have the least amount of conflict possible. And as soon as I say that, your writers are going to understand why that's so difficult to tell a story that way, right? Because that means we're trying to lessen conflict in the story. But another thing that I always recommend that writers do is look at the best examples in the form. So if you want to look at what female myth can be and how you can tell stories that way, look at some examples. Again, Avatar started, but Avatar is really going from male myth to female myth within one story. Gravity is a female myth story. Arrival, great female myth, science fiction myth. It's a combination of science fiction and myth. And brilliant female myth story, Inside Out. Take a look at any of those, break them down, look to see how they handle. You still got the journey of the hero, but look how they handle, how the character handles conflict with various opponents along the path. Totally different approach.
I love that example. That's all the webinar we have today, everybody. I'm just kidding. That was awesome. No, that was
I
enough.
just have to tell you, like, listening to all of this, there have been multiple times where I'm getting like goosebumps just because just even talking, I didn't even know before I read the book about female myth necessarily. I didn't really put that, and I'm currently writing something that has that. So now it's like, go back and like figure out, okay, I'm going to go to that chapter. You know what I mean? Like, and really like dive into that. But I've gotten goosebumps like multiple times.
Well, that's great to hear. And you know, just to do a final thing to that male myth versus female myth, don't make the mistake that many writers make in terms of they write a male myth story with a female lead, like Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman's a wonderful picture. It's not a female myth. Just because you have a female lead doesn't make it a female myth. It's what happens on the structure beats on the path.
Right.
Yeah. God, I have so many things that we could talk about there, but we'll go let's go another 15 minutes ish here, John, and we'll cover the rest of the
let me pop through these genres quickly. The next chapter is on memoir and coming of age story. And memoir is about creating the self through nonfiction, whereas the coming of age story is about creating the self through fiction. So they're opposites in the sense of nonfiction and fiction, but they're essentially thematically doing the same thing. And the interesting thing in terms of memoir and coming of age, we typically think of memoir is it's about looking back at our past. In fact, the memoir is about how you craft your future. You are looking back at your past in order to change your future, not just to get a picture of what happened to you in the past. Coming of age is what has become one of the most popular genres in Hollywood. And the problem that writers have with coming of age is they think of it in too narrow a way. They think of it as coming of age as in the normal teenager becoming an adult. Yes, most coming of age stories do that, but you can have a coming of age story at any point in a person's life. The coming of age is all about what are the key forces that made me who I am today. And so when we try to express that, the big problem that we run into is it's very strong in terms of drama, but drama is known for not having much plot. And so what you try to do in order to, if you're going to write a coming of age story, you want to mix it with some other genre. What is one of the most famous coming of age stories in American literature? Huckleberry Finn. What did he do? He combined coming of age with the myth journey story.
You could argue as good as it gets is you could say that's partial coming of age. Jack Nicholson comes of age very late in life. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a lot of guys walking around that are boys in an adult body. Mm-hmm. And what they have to do is become a real adult. Yeah. So we know all about those people. But so the next form that I talk about is science fiction. And science fiction isn't just about technology. It always emphasizes the technology in the culture more than any other genre that emphasizes story world. But what science fiction is really about at the highest level is how do you create society? And in fact, it's how do you avoid an enslaved society and create a one of freedom? So this is why science fiction has been called in the past social philosophy in fiction form. It is the biggest of all genres in terms of the biggest scope. You create everything, and it's very much an intellectual exercise where you are trying to figure out or show what is a new version of society that is better than the one we have now. And it's all about focusing on the choices that we as a society are making right now. And if we don't make the right choices, we'll get the kind of dystopian future that is portrayed in that story. So it is science fiction is a very challenging form. I go into it in some detail in terms of these are the elements that you have to create your own society in the story. And, you know, in terms of transcending it, the main technique that you would do is combine it with the myth form. Because again, myth gives us the longest track of growth. And so we get stories like a good example of that would be 2001. 2001 is basically a scientific creation myth, not based on space, but based on time, because it goes through the steps of human evolution from, you know, the ape-like creature to the universal baby, whatever that might be. And I've never quite figured that out. But that's the kind of scope that we're talking about. You're talking about not just the epic of a nation, you're talking about the epic of the universe. So if you like that stuff, go for it. One thing to keep in mind, don't suck the emotion out of the story. These science fiction stories tend to be very clinical. They're very intellectual. That's a kiss of death. You've got to keep the emotions and the flaws of the character front and center at all times. Otherwise, it's just going to be a distant intellectual exercise for the viewer.
Yeah. It's highly metaphorical science fiction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The next story form I talk about is crime. And crime is really about the legal and moral code of a society. And, you know, I by the way, I use a lot of examples from television in the book, because I believe in the last 20 years, we've had two major story revolutions that we've lived through. And these revolutions are as big as the rise of the novel in the early 1700s and the rise of film in the 1910s. The first one is one of them is the one I already talked about, which is the rise of the female myth, the return of the female myth. The second one is the rise of television as an art form. Because of the move to serial storytelling, serial story structure, TV has gone from the kind of the little step cousin to film to far surpassing, in my opinion, the quality of the writing and the quality of drama that we see in storytelling today. It is the best writing, the best storytelling that we see in the world. And it has been really since The Sopranos, which brought in this kind of serial storytelling structure. And in the crime chapter, I use as a major example Breaking Bad, one of the greatest stories that we've had in the last 100 years. I mean, and if you look at, I consider it one of the 5 best TV shows ever made, along with my favorite show ever made, Mad Men, which I talk about in The Gangster Story, which I consider the best TV show ever made. And I accept no argument on that matter. If you don't agree with me, just don't talk to me. But Mad Men is our Great Gatsby. And Great Gatsby is, in many ways, they're very, very much connected with each other, including the fact that each main character is based on making up a fake identity so that he could try to be, and this is part of the American creed that we see in gangster stories and Westerns, which is the American creed is you can be whoever you want to be. And so in both Gatsby and in the main character in Mad Men, they have both created a new persona so they can be whoever they want to be. And there's some benefits to that. That's why we love being Americans, but there's also some real problems with that. So I consider Gatsby to be the great American novel, and I consider Mad Men to be the great American novel on television, and of absolute massive brilliance in terms of what Matthew Weiner was able to do there. My respect for these, one of the things that was so great about going through these different genres and these different stories in the genres is the greats, the quality of the writing in these great stories is just so overwhelming. And with the beauty, the fun for me was taking these techniques that each genre is built on and then reapplying it to stories that we're very familiar with and saying, oh, that's why it works so well. I didn't know that. I just love that story. But this really shows you what those writers were doing to create that effect. And to me, whenever I see great writing, it's just overwhelmingly exciting to me. I just absolutely love it. In terms of transcending crime, the key there is we want to put into contrast what is legal versus what is moral. They are not the same. And the greatest crime stories, the transcendent crime stories, do that. The next genre I talk about is comedy. And comedy, like crime, deals with morality. But comedy deals with it on the everyday basis. And in morality with the small m. It's like, and I use Seinfeld as an example in this, because Seinfeld was based on these little hurts, these little transgressions that people do to you every day in modern life, and it's like, I remember one of them was Elaine is dating this really handsome guy who she calls a mimbo, right? He's a male bimbo, right? But he has this, Kramer takes him on his mountain climbing trip where he gets horribly disfigured. And now Elaine is facing the moral issue of, how long do I still have to date this guy when he is no longer a beautiful person? And the Seinfeld was just filled with that. And of course, I always refer to Seinfeld as the karma comedy, because it would always take this very roundabout plot, the most heavily plotted sitcom in history by far, for not just one, but 4 characters that they would interweave. Mm-hmm. And somehow they would get to the end, this karma result where everybody got paid back what they deserved, but in a way you would never have expected it. But that's what really advanced comedy does. It talks about how do you, and what's really interesting about it is fundamentally different than all the other genres in one way, which is that all the other genres are about how the world works, whether negatively or positively. Comedy is about how it doesn't work. And yet the big flip at the end is somehow it all turns out fine at the end. And in fact, even a little better than it was at the beginning. The next genre I talk about is the Western, which is as I mentioned, I think I mentioned America's creation myth. It's about the rise of the American dream. And as a classic form, it's mostly disappeared. Where we see it sometimes is with an occasional anti-Western. But where you still see it, and it's really popular, is again mixing it with science fiction. Outer space Western don't get any more popular than that. And all you have to do is look at Han Solo to see how popular that character can be. And of course, The Mandalorian is basically an outer space Western now, super popular. The gangster story is a direct outgrowth of the Western. If the Western is about the rise of the American dream, the gangster is about the corruption of the American dream. So with those two genres, you get the rise and fall of America. which is why those two chapters were my favorite chapters to write. I mean, I love all my children, but I love all these genres, but those two, in terms of giving you an understanding of the ethos of America, both its strengths and its weaknesses. I mean, these things are just incredibly powerful. And of course, you get all of the great masterpieces in the gangster form, The Godfathers, Goodfellas, on TV, Peaky Blinders, just a brilliant TV show, gangster show from England. And I talk there about how to transcend the gangster story with what I call the economic political epic, which is, two of the best examples of it are Mad Men and Great Gatsby. And I talk about network there as well. I mean, those three are just right at the top in terms of that particular story form, the corruption of the American dream. Now we're getting to the very top of the ladder in terms of the wisdom that these genres give us. And those top three are fantasy, followed by detective and thriller, which are in the same chapter, and ending up with love. Fantasy is about how we learn to live with style and freedom. And it's really about how do you make life itself a work of art? How do you learn to live, not just survive, but live well? And you do it by finding the magic that's in yourself and in your world. And this is why fantasy is so incredibly popular, because that is a message that's so incredibly affirming to people and so important for somebody to learn. Then, of course, detective story, we're getting into the story of the mind and the story of truth, finding the truth. And it's interesting, Edgar Allan Poe, massively important in the history of story. He not only created the modern day horror story, he created the detective story. And when you think about these two forms, they are in many ways totally opposite forms. And yet there's a reason that this one guy figured them both out. It's because the horror story shows the mind at its lowest form, the irrational mind. Detective story shows the mind at its most brilliant. It is the rational mind. And so, Poe, the master of the mind, was able to create a story form at both extremes. Again, my respect for this guy is just overwhelming. But you get with a detective story, detective stories are really about how to think successfully, how to think well. And the brilliance of it is that the way they do it dramatically is by comparing stories. And essentially every detective story comes down to a comparison between two stories: the killer's view of the truth, the detective's view of the truth. And the question is, with all the signs, whose version of the truth will the police accept as true?
So could you say that as a part of the detective genre theme, it's basically how to change your mind, or what happens when your mind changes?
It's what happens when your mind congeals, when your mind becomes an ideology, and when you're trapped within your own point of view.
I see.
Because and this is why so many detective stories are from first point of view, is because it shows that while that is a tremendous advantage to us as human beings, it is a huge disadvantage. It's extremely limiting, because there's all these things, there's the Rashomon effect, all these things happening that we don't know about because they're not in our point of view. And yet that could be the real truth. And one of my favorite parts of the book is when I talk about transcending the detective story, because these are stories of the mind and how it works and how it doesn't work. You get into playing with stream of consciousness, what that's all about, and so on and so forth. That's really advanced mental storytelling. And again, like science fiction, you have the danger gets very heady, very intellectual, and you can lose the emotion. You've got to keep the emotion in the story, or you're failing in your first job as a writer, which is have an emotional effect on your reader.
So in a lot of ways, then you are, I mean, I'm probably paraphrasing, you're combining thriller and detective.
There's a reason for it. There's a reason for it. Both are based on investigation. That is the desire line of the hero. There's a number of differences that distinguish detective from thriller. But the most important one is that in a detective story, it is essentially an intellectual exercise where we have a very brilliant mind uncovering the truth, but we're never really worried about their safety. Thriller is somebody who is an investigator. They're almost never a professional investigator. They're usually an average citizen. They're investigating a crime, usually a murder, but they're an average citizen. So they have no clue how to do it, which means that they get into major danger over the course of the story. And what does that do? It adds a massive amount of emotion to what in detective story is essentially an intellectual exercise.
All right. So finally, last one, love.
Love is the highest genre because love gives us the recipe for day-to-day happiness. And I talk in the book about the fact that, romance novels are often made fun of. They happen to be the most popular genre in the world. And in my opinion, they are the highest genre there is because they give the greatest gift to the reader, which is how do you live the best life every day? You do it by learning how to love. And in the book, I talk about what does that mean? It really means learning the moral act of love. In other words, most people think in terms of writing a love story as we're tracking the emotional build and the emotional connection between two people. And that certainly happens. That's what happens on the surface. But if you look at the beats of the love story, it's each person has to learn the moral act of love. How do you live with another person so that both of your lives together are better? And that typically involves each person learning that they have to sacrifice some of their individual goal so that the other person can get their goal. And what they learn at the end in a double self-revelation where each has a major insight about how they've been wrong, they learn that we are so much better together than we are individually. And this is why love stories are about blossoming. They're about starting two characters. And by the way, it's the only genre with two main characters. Start two characters close down about love. And then over the course of the story, through the heat and light of the other person, they blossom together and they become the fullest sense of who each of them can be.
So there's an interesting reference to biopic as if you forgot that genre. So what do you say about biopic? It's in a way a memoir.
Exactly. It's memoir is part of a larger category, which is the true story. And there's different versions of true story, but biopic is one of them. Yeah. But biopic is also the structural techniques and beats that you use in biopic are very similar to memoir. It's just the difference of in memoir, I'm doing it about me, and in biopic, I'm doing it about her.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's get into the questions. We'll go about 15 to 20 minutes here. I want to open those up. Shana and we'll just both kind of go through them. I will say for everybody listening and watching, please don't rely on this webinar as if now you have all of the information because you don't. This is incredibly valuable information that we're chatting about here, but buy John's book, obviously, but also do your research on all this. John is not the only human being to ever write a book on genre, but I think in terms of extensiveness, I think this is the one that you should be reading, but do your research. I think for me, it's a light bulb moment that I don't know enough about genre. And I've been studying and working in the world of writing and screenwriting for 20 plus years. And I don't know enough, so I think for all of us, this is a big wake-up call. What do we got here for questions? Shannon, did you find anything?
Yeah, I also want to add to that. We had a question about, can someone list all 14? If you go to John's website, the cover of the book actually shows all of those 14 genres on the cover of the book. So very easy reference to go take a look at that.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get to
And
these
by the
questions.
way, I fought for that with the publisher. I said, you got to get all 14. They said, we don't want to list all 14 genres on the cover. I said, you got to do that because people have to know what they're going to get when they get this book.
Right. And that is, I mean, you're getting a lot in this book. This isn't an infomercial to sell the book, but if you want to learn, get the book and read it. There's a question on here. Is it going to be available on Audible? So we'll start with that one.
That is, the publisher controls that. I would love to do an Audible book of it. I suspect that there will be one at some time. I suspect also that they have some worry about that, a reluctance to do that because it is over 700 pages. And that's a lot of Audible. But I think it would be a great Audible book, and people would really love to take in that information that way.
At the very least, John, you could do a multiple episode podcast, and every episode is a genre. I'm serious that people would listen to that.
Yeah.
Joe Beatty is asking an interesting question. How does Only Murders in the Building mix genres with its mystery, comedy, and drama genres? Do you think it mixes well? You didn't note drama as a genre.
No, and there's a very specific reason for that. Drama is a story form, but it's much bigger than a genre. You recall that I was talking about the different genres, that each has its own predetermined hero, predetermined opponent, predetermined desire line, and set plot beats, among other things that come with that form. Drama is much broader than that and much looser than that. So anyone can be the hero in a drama. Anyone can be the opponent. And one of the reasons that drama, in the classic sense of drama, is a challenge to write is because it tends to lack these very clear plot beats that the other genres have. And so even though it is a story form, it doesn't have the landmarks that the other genres have. So, but there are certain elements that are distinctive about it. So, for example, whoever your hero is, the opponent tends to be personal, tends to be intimate, typically within the family. And this is why memoir is really a personal drama, right? And one of the challenges of memoir is they don't tend to have a lot of plot. And so what do? We combine it with at least one other genre. And what's the most common that we combine the memoir with? Detective story. So detective story gives you these clean plot beats that are very, and by the way, detective is the most complex plot of all genres. So you combine personal drama with detective, you get, again, have your cake and eat it too. You get the plot beats of detective, you get the personal and emotional punch that only drama can give. Drama has the most powerful emotional punch of any story. Now, a perfect example of that is in Coming-of-age story, which is a kind of drama. Recent example is Coda. Now, Coda, there are certain plot beats that a Coming-of-age gives you, but when you look at Coda, here's a story, very small story, that wins the Academy Award. Okay, a friend of mine was saying after it won the award, it's like a TV movie from the 80s. How does that win the Academy Award? And I've responded that, well, it may be like a TV drama of the 80s, but it packs more emotion, and a TV drama in the 80s packed more emotion in that hour and a half than any superhero movie you've ever seen. And that's what drama has. And so when you get, and that's the beauty of something like Only Murders in the Building, is you get your mystery and a little bit of thriller aspect because they're not professionals, so they get in a little bit of a danger. You get the combination with comedy, which lightens it up. And then you get the drama elements for those occasional beats of intimacy where, and this is what dramedy does, is it goes back and forth over the line between comedy and drama. And so you, again, get the benefit of both worlds. You get the jokes, you get the funniness of comedy, but you get real intense emotional experience from the drama form. And so, again, mixing genres, if you can mix genres in a unique way, you have got the recipe for real success.
I mean, TV today it's changed the scope of story so much, because before it used to be it was a drama or it was a comedy. Like that's all you got. It was a half-hour comedy sitcom, or it was an hour long. And now you've got the Dead to Me's of the world, and you know all these just wonderful shows. Only Murders in the Building, I love that show, but I think I like it so much because yes, it's funny, but all these characters are learning things about themselves, and therefore you have dramatic storylines.
Right, exactly. And we, a lot of the reason for what you just described, which is again a major evolution, has to do with the fact that the distribution system of these stories, the fact that it's on streaming and the fact that it can be binge watched has totally changed the game in terms of how we as writers work. And so we have to be very clear about what type of medium we are writing for, because it isn't the old sitcom where a joke every 30 seconds, bam, 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 in a 22-minute period. No, it's, and that also means things like the setup of the entire show on a streaming show is much slower.
Yeah.
But they know that we're dealing with the season. We're not dealing with each episode. That's the key. That's what serial structure. That's the major change that it did. It went from making the unit of measure of a show's success went from the episode to the season, and that's what binge watchers are looking for. Yeah. And so that changes how you write, and you have to be very clear about what you're writing.
Yeah. Shana, what else we got here? I know there are a whole bunch of really good ones.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of ones that I feel like are long conversations. So here's one we're gonna just ask you your opinion on. Robert's asking, regarding combining genres, would you assume that Rocky is in the action genre mixed with love?
That is exactly what it is, and that's why it's so successful. It is a sports love story, and if you were to do either of those alone, you wouldn't have had anywhere near the success that had. But to two of them together, the fact that he gets 2 goals at the end of that story, he almost wins the heavyweight fight and goes from being a bum to being somebody who has great self-respect, who also ends up in love with and transforming another person who also helped him transform. You get that external success, you get the internal success. Again, the power of, you've combined genres in the right way, especially, and this is a really important trick, try to combine genres that have not been combined in the past. For example, Inception is a combination of a heist story plus science fiction. And we've never seen that before. So all of a sudden that comes out, and that combination of plot beats, we go, wow, that's really cool. And so if you can find combinations, mixes, and that at the time, Rocky, there was nothing else that had done that before. And it was like, whoa, best picture. And I believe rightfully so, although I believe that was the same year as Network. And I believe at the time, I was not happy that Rocky won.
Network was so good. Lori asks a really good question, because it's kind of segueing a little bit, because from the previous question, I think the previous question was kind of like, is it a 50-50 kind of ratio of combining and mixing? But then Lori's asking, what happens as you mix genres with different story beats? How do you determine which beats to use if certain genres have different structural beats?
It goes back to what we talked about earlier about choosing the primary genre. The primary genre tells you what beats must be there. Then you take the second and third genre, and you take the beats only when they work with the main genre beats. And why do I say that? Because the different genres have different beats that they're all story structure beats, but in certain genres, they are direct opposites in what they do. And so you can't have them both at the same time in the same story. So what you do is you give primacy to the beats of the primary genre, and you take the beats from the secondary genres only when they work with the main storyline. If they don't work, don't use them.
Here's a good one I think that Shana and I are going to be interested in. Carlton Saito is asking, aren't horror, and I think we already know what the basic answer it will be to this, but I'd like your explanation. Aren't horror and science fiction really subgenres of fantasy?
This is a great question. It gets into an important distinction between genre and genre elements. We've had fantasy elements in stories as long as we've had stories. And, and by the way, often writers confuse myth and fantasy. They have many of the same elements in them. But when we talk about genres, we're talking about a story structure system, a plot system. And so while horror and science fiction both borrow from fantasy elements, they're not borrowing the fantasy story structure. That's a very important distinction. Mm-hmm. Now, again, remember I mentioned earlier that those three genres are in the same family. So they're going to have a lot of overlap and a lot of elements that, you can, but what you have to determine is which is the best genre in the speculative fiction family to express this particular idea.
Shane, I think we have, let's do maybe.
There's a great one from the chat that just popped in, and this is a great one to end with, because this always comes up when you think of like action movie. Die Hard is an action movie. Does it transcend the genre?
Boy, that's another good question. I consider that it does transcend, but only because in the book, a lot of the main examples that I use, and I use Die Hard a lot in the action chapter, I use them because they define the form. Like Frankenstein defined the horror form from then on. Die Hard didn't define the form. It had been around for a while, but it executes the form so perfectly that you cannot think of an action movie without thinking of Die Hard. Right. And by the way, if you want to learn how to write it, the action form, study Die Hard. That's not going to give you everything, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close. And so in terms of theme, does it transcend? No, it doesn't. In terms of technique and execution, yes, it's as good as you can get.
Yeah, because of this is highly arguable, slight coming of age of the main character in Die Hard. Just enough to be noticeable so that you're like, okay, he kind of makes good with his wife that he had outs with. Like there were other things going on personally for him. And I think that's what helped it kind of transcend beyond.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things to learn from it when you study it is good action stories are not just success of the goal. Yeah. You've got to have the character change underneath because that's what gives the emotional payoff. And it makes the success of the goal 10 times better and more appealing to the audience.
Yeah. Let's do the last one, Shannon. This is going to be a kind of a different topic, but this is a big deal in terms of the industry and where entertainment is going. This is probably a much longer conversation, John. So we don't need to go too crazy into this, but Daniel's asking, video games are becoming more and more cinematic. How does posing the audience as a protagonist contribute towards understanding the genre? And can I cite your response in my dissertation? So how do you look at video games from that space? It's a really interesting point of view.
Video games are the rise of video games is again, they're one of the major story mediums. When they first started to evolve, I remember thinking this the potential of this medium is unlimited, how great it can be. Now, what has happened, and this is normal for when a story medium first starts to come on to the stage, which is it's based primarily on sensation. It's based, for example, in film, it was like, they point a gun, the cowboy points the gun right at the audience and they all, back up. That's sensation. And it's really exciting. Well, what takes it into an art form is when you get into the character, where you get into complex character that the story is going to unravel, because plot is simply the unraveling of character through action of the hero trying to get the goal. And so what video game does is it makes it more difficult to get out of this sensation element that it's so great at, better than anything else, and get it to that larger art form, those other pleasures that people get from watching stories. And so, but I think, I'm by no means an expert in video games, but I know that it has made a lot of progress in that area. But the one thing I would also say in terms of this question is each medium handles genres differently. And they change the genre in fundamental ways. So, for example, when you look at television and novels, because they are longer forms and they're much more complex and extended plots, how they play out the beats of a particular genre is going to be very different than the way a movie does. Still the same genre, but you have to know the medium that you're working in order to really get the most out of your particular story. So, the trick is to, I would say, for those who are writing video games and reading this book, read the book for the beats in terms and for the larger theme of what it's doing. And then you yourself make the corrections, the fixes in terms of how is that going to play out in a medium like video games, where the main character is also the player.
Yeah, that's a deep dive. Like that one's we could really dig in. I do think that the genre structural beats are still probably played out. It's just obviously there isn't a timing situation, especially in these big open world games where you can just wander off into the woods and chop a tree down. There's no structure to that, but there are still expectations for various storylines that you can follow, like in of course, like Skyrim. Skyrim was one of those games that it was just, there were 150,000 different stories you could play out, and all of them did still follow along some form of a structure, considering genre alongside of it. That kind of makes my brain melt a little bit. But
it's kind of like, you think of video games structurally, it's kind of like every video game you write is Game of Thrones times 10 in terms of the potential plot permutations that you can have. So that's why, the respect I have for video game writers is beyond the charts, because keeping track of those plot permutations and keeping the threads interwoven, boy, that's tough.
Yeah. Well, Shannon,
right.
I think that's all we got.
So just the last question to kind of wrap it up, where can people go for more of John Truby besides this book? If they're looking for classes or, more education from you, John, where can they go?
Shana, let me give your listeners two sites to go to. The first is for the book. If you want to get the book, you can go to anatomyofgenres.com. That's all one word, Anatomy of Genres. And if you're interested in any of my courses or my Blockbuster Story software, you just want to go to truby.com, TRUBY.com.
I love it. This was awesome. And John, if there is the possibility of doing a podcast on each individual genre, honestly, I would consider maybe we should figure that out, because even just for my own selfish reasons, you can just treat me like a student. But yeah,
I'm in. You have a listener right here.
I can't tell you how much fun this has been. You guys are great, and I just love talking about this subject, partly because it's so infinite, and I'm so excited about it. Today is the pub date. Today is the day it comes out.
Yay.
And I wanted to be on this show when that happened. And I'm just so excited about what this book can do for writers in terms of helping them make that big jump from being a writer to being one of the top writers and somebody able to sell their material and have their own story brand. I believe that this book will be extremely useful to people in doing that.
I think so too. Yeah.
Excellent.
All right. Well, we already had, I think, 3 or 4 people in the comment section, John, say just bought the book. So people, it's working.
Good,
This
good.
is working.
Glad to hear
it. Yeah. December 7th, everybody, is a Wednesday, is when my webinar is coming up. Jacqueline asked, I want to know more about it. It's about character and structure. I don't want to go too much into it, but you can get an invite through the ISA. We'll send something out through Eventbrite. It's a free webinar for our ISA members. And I think that's it. Shana, any last thoughts?
Go buy the book. Do it. Buy the book, read it, study it. Thank you, John. That was an amazing talk. I feel like now I need to go back and rewatch it again just to like really tune in more. And I am ecstatic about the female myth. And I'm going to go read that chapter again in the book. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. And people are saying more John, more John. So yeah, I think you really need to think about this podcast idea.
I love the idea. Thank you, Shana. Thank you, Max. This has been such a great pleasure. I've loved being a guest on your show.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll see you all soon.
Bye, everybody.